Check, 1, 2.
One, two, three.
From London, welcome to Pièce de Résistance, a show about the geopolitical stakes of a world in turmoil. I'm your host, Stan Vojevodsky. Today we'll discuss the Trump administration's pivot back to the Western Hemisphere and focus on Venezuela and what the implications are for the region and U.S. national security. To try and shed some light and get some answers, I've stepped out of my geopolitical bunker to join my special guest, Dr. Chris Sabatini, Senior Fellow for the Americas at the Royal Institute for International Affairs, commonly known as Chatham House. Chris, thank you for accepting not only to participate in this program today, but also welcoming the show in this temple of international policy discussion that has been Chatham House for the past 100 years. You've spent the better part of your career studying the Western Hemisphere, from the Southern Cone to the Caribbean and the region's relation to Washington, D.C. You stand today as one of the most respected and better informed experts on a region we both love so much. From your years at the National Endowment for Democracy to the Council of the Americas, where you founded and were editor-in-chief of America's Quarterly, to the advisory boards of Harvard, Human Rights Watch, Inter-American Dialogue, you've testified in Congress, the U.S. Senate, lectured in Columbia and other prestigious universities on issues relating to the region. You've written extensively on the topic of Venezuela and Latin America and are regularly invited by mainstream media to give your expertise on the matter. So I couldn't ask for a better brain to pick today on this issue. My first question relates to U.S. Policy towards the hemisphere. Over the last decades, we've seen U.S. military operations unfold, from Grenada to Panama in the 80s, to Haiti in the 90s and early 2000s. Since the Monroe Doctrine in the 19th century, U.S. intervention is a policy that has played out time and again in our hemisphere. But for the better part of the last 20 years, with the war on terror and heightened tensions with Moscow on Europe's eastern flank, the region has been shunned by Washington and relegated to a non-essential role. With the recent national security strategy released last week by the Trump administration, we now see a complete change in doctrine towards the region. So I'll start with an oversimplified and binary question summed up in a quote by Mexican President Porfirio Díaz, "Pobre México, tan cerca de los Estados Unidos, tan lejos de Dios." Poor Mexico, so close to the United States, so far from God. Is being a neighbor of the United States a blessing or a curse?
Well, first of all, Stan, thanks for having me. It's an honor to be here. An honor to host you, too. I hope to see you around in Chatham House a lot more frequently now that you've moved here. So
thank you.
Look forward to it. It is, there are times when, if you look at the evolution of U.S. foreign policy, edit that out. If you look at the evolution of U.S. foreign policy in the region after the Cold War, there was a sense that of what the Inter-American Dialogue termed consensus and convergence, that they were all sort of converging towards the practicality of democracy, market-based economies, free trade, and that fractured. I would say it actually started to fracture in 2000 with Alberto Fujimori when he tried to run for a constitutionally questionable third term. But it's become much more divisive over time as the U.S. politics and polarization have become much more divisive. During the times of the high water mark of consensus and cooperation between the countries in the hemisphere, in the United States and Canada, there are some very real achievements. The North American Free Trade Agreement, support and collaboration on free elections, on human rights, on reform of judicial systems, on support for civil society, on free media, at times even pushing back against coup attempts, whether in Paraguay, Guatemala, and elsewhere. So those are real achievements. And the fact is I've been traveling to Latin America for a long time, and you go to, even in terms of economic development, in terms of freedom, it's a long place from where it was, say, in the 1980s. And that's unmistakable and undeniable. And the U.S. played a very strong role in that, as it did in the economic growth that was in the 2000s, fueled in large part because of the demand for raw materials from China and India. But there's a real growth of the middle class. There's a real growth in investment in cities. The debt structure right now is much better than it has been in the past. But having said that, what's happened is Latin America and the U.S. become much more polarized, Latin America has become somewhat of a political football. And I mean that either in the soccer sense or the U.S.-American football sense, and that it gets kicked around a lot. And so what we're seeing right now, as you mentioned, the Trump national security strategy, is first time, I think, a real honest and frank look at what he wants to do and what his advisors want to do. Usually, in fact, Latin America wasn't even mentioned, I believe, in the Biden national security strategy document. So at least it's there, it's front and center, but the question is how it's there. And it's really a reassertion of U.S. hegemony in the region. But I would say it's not just U.S. power as it was, say, under the Roosevelt corollary, the Theodore Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, which is really about creating a secure place to protect U.S. borders, to encourage investors and be able to extract Latin America's resources. This is a very partisan division. Yes, it's still wrapped up very much in the idea of defending the country from immigrants, illegal immigrants, undocumented immigrants, I prefer to say, from illegal drugs. But it's also very much a partisan project. What he's saying and what he's doing is effectively dangling a lot of the benefits that the U.S. used to offer without concern for partisanship. Again, in the Clinton administration, I worked in the USAID. The mantra was, it's about the process, not who wins. Well, now it's clearly about who wins. And that varied. Obviously, George W. Bush had his favorites, Alvaro Uribe. Even under the Biden administration, when it looked like Bernardo Arevalo, the president of Guatemala, had won, the Biden administration did everything it could to make sure that he did reach the presidential palace, including placing sanctions on those blocking. But right now, what we see with Trump are two things. First is an effort to create a hemisphere through elections that looks much more like Trump's own vision of his politics. We saw this in the midterm elections in Argentina when he offered the $20 billion line of credit contingent on Milei's winning, President Javier Milei winning, his party winning the midterm elections. I've never seen that level of bribery, extortion, whatever you want to call it. And then, of course, he endorsed the candidate Asfuda in Honduras against two other candidates, one of which he called a communist and the other one he called a borderline communist. This is a level of partisan intervention we've never seen. I'll just add one more to this, which is the case of Brazil, where basically Trump imposed 50% tariffs on most Brazilian exports to the United States simply because an independent Supreme Court was trying a former president for insurrection. That former president, Jair Bolsonaro, and the Supreme Court justice who was leading that charge, de Moraes, was then sanctioned by the U.S. government as well as his family for engaging in an investigation of an insurrection. This is unprecedented, and yet I think we've sort of become numb to it. So, yes, this is very different. It's very clear what he wants to do. I'll hand him that. Transparency isn't always a Trump strong suit. But in this case, it's a different approach entirely from what we've seen in the past.
Thank you. My second question has three parts, in which you can perhaps answer in the order of priority. President Trump and his senior cabinet members have explicitly accused President Maduro's regime of being behind drug smuggling cartels, like Cartel de los Soles, drugs which, according to President Trump, kill upwards of 100,000 American citizens every year by bringing illegal narcotics and fentanyl into the country. As such, the embattled regime is now facing a terrorist designation. Its leader, Nicolas Maduro, is facing a $50 million bounty for his capture. Kinetic operations in the Caribbean waters over the last couple of months against drug smugglers have gotten a lot of press and put the war on drugs back as a central policy of this administration as relates to the Western Hemisphere. At the same time, many consider Trump's move on Venezuela to be mainly driven by a desire to secure the 500 billion barrels reserve of the Orinoco Belt, generally accepted by all as the largest recoverable oil reserves in the world. Yet that oil is heavy crude, which is great for asphalt, ship fuel, kerosene, power plant generations. But the U.S. is already energy sufficient and has been the main producer of light crude and natural gas globally since 2009. Finally, a third argument used is that the time has come to drive out non-aligned entrenched regimes like Venezuela, Cuba, Nicaragua, and more recently Petro's government in Colombia, and checkmate their military and political alliances with our global adversaries, Russia, China, and to a lesser extent, Iran. The first seems to cater to U.S. public opinion. The second seems to cater to an industrial and investment financial audience. And the third one seems to cater to geopolitical analysts and beltway policy hawks. So there seems to be a narrative for every audience here. If you had to pick one as the overarching motive, which would it be?
Ouch, that's a tough one. I think the narrative really that is the most powerful for this administration and the one that's the most compelling internally for them is the one of regime change, is the one of has been if you will, sort of a sore spot for the U.S. for a long time since Hugo Chavez was elected. Not so much when he's elected, but when he started to consolidate power with the 2000 Constitution, which he then used the opportunity, the vacuum power, to pack the Supreme Court and begin to dismantle the very institutions his Constitution had created, at least their independence. But what's happening here is last year the opposition did attempt to participate in elections. It had, unfortunately, I think, boycotted in many of the elections, so sat out those games. This time the Biden administration pushed the Maduro government to have the elections. The opposition had a primary. They competed in the elections. The woman who won the primary, Maria Corina Machado, who today, in fact, will be receiving indirectly, her daughter will be receiving the Nobel Peace Prize for her efforts, was not allowed to run. And working with a stand-in candidate, the opposition clearly won, but the election was stolen. And the election observers that were there have the evidence. This evidence was, in fact, verified by statisticians in Spain and in Brazil. That fed very much into what Marco Rubio's sort of narrative about, the need to promote a regime change in Venezuela, not just removing Maduro and his cronies. And indeed, it is a corrupt government. In that they're right. And it is a government that is involved in different illicit activities. We can talk about what those are. They're not what Trump actually is accusing them of mostly. But in this particular case, I think Marco Rubio and a few others around him basically think that if you can remove Maduro, then Cuba will fall. For many of the hardline Cuban Americans, for whom the Castro regime has been their bête noire for decades now. There's been an embargo on Cuba since 1962. The Cuban regime's still there. And what happened was most people believed, we can talk about the fallacy of this belief, that Cuba was about to collapse around the time that Hugo Chavez was elected. And shortly after being inaugurated in 1999, Hugo Chavez basically started to donate, if you will, or give to Cuba at low prices 100,000 barrels of oil a day, which propped up the Cuban government because it sold half of those barrels on the open market, was able to generate revenue. So for many Cuban Americans, the problem isn't just that the Chavez and Maduro government is a self-proclaimed socialist revolution. It's really not socialist, by the way. It's martial. It's dominated by the military. It's corrupt. It's a stretch to say it's just simply a regime that's very good at breaking boundaries between independent institutions and redistributing patronage to allies. Nevertheless, they see that as the reason why Cuba is still there. So it's regime change, and that's the strongest narrative. To go to the other two. The first one on the drugs, the truth is, and you kind of implied this, Stan, so I'll second it. Venezuela doesn't produce fentanyl. Fentanyl is the number one killer of Americans who consume drugs. It's Mexico that produces and ships the fentanyl. Colombia produces most of the cocaine. There's some cocaine labs on the border between Colombia and Venezuela, but Venezuela is mostly a transshipment point for that cocaine. And most of that is actually bound for Europe or Western Africa. The truth is, only about 5 to 8% of the cocaine that's consumed in the United States comes from Venezuela. They are correct that this is a deeply corrupt government. They are correct that there is illegal mining, gold mining, conducted largely by the ELN in collaboration. The ELN is the Colombian guerrilla group in collaboration with the army. There's human trafficking, money laundering, all sorts of nefarious activities that center there. But it is indeed a transnational threat, mostly to the region, not to the United States. And then the other two reasons you mentioned, one was foreign influence powers. Yes, it's true. Russia owns a lot of Venezuelan distressed bonds. By the way, the reason why is because of the secondary sanctions placed on Venezuela after the 2019 effort to unseat Maduro through the Juan Guaido experiment, as I like to call it. But yes, China is involved. It's lent a lot to Venezuela. Iran has some influence, but it's not. These are not central operations. There's not much that Russia can really do in Venezuela. And Iran is pretty tied down itself because of its own embargo and attempts to isolate it. And for China, in many ways, if you talk to some people who study China or even Chinese government officials, they'll say Venezuela is more of a liability than it is an asset. But of course, that rankles for an administration that has actively said you can't be a world power if you can't dominate your own hemisphere. And just on the oil resources, the truth is, as you said correctly, is the U.S. is self-sufficient. The truth is, if that oil were to be tapped immediately, it would probably drive down the price of global oil, which would hurt U.S. national interests. But that said, yes, there are some lobbyists in Washington on K Street, the lobbying sort of corridor, who are advocating for some, not necessarily regime change. They would be happy if it's Maduro that stay there, just at least let them get their noses under the tent and start to invest and eventually pump oil. But that's I would say that's a tertiary reason, and not figuring in the calculations of maybe Donald Trump, given his sort of transactional materialist view of foreign policy, but it's not the primary reason. Certainly not a Marco Rubio.
Okay. Thank you. Actually, you've touched upon state and non-state actors from outside Venezuela, and we'll get back to that. But I do want to talk about our beloved community of Venezuelan exiles in the U.S. and across the hemisphere. Over the last 7 years, 8 million Venezuelans have fled to the U.S. and across the region, putting great pressure and at times heightening social tensions for all recipient countries. The middle class has been decimated in Venezuela and expatriated itself, not to mention, obviously, the higher class, the bourgeoisie, who were the first to leave during the Chavez years and the related persecution and expropriations of private industries and businesses. There's definitely a sense of renewed optimism, not to say enthusiasm, backed by a lot of the media narrative that's out there in those Venezuelan communities that the end of the regime is near. But they felt betrayed before by failed attempts at pushing the regime out, promises not kept by Maduro towards a democratic transition, or, as you mentioned earlier, rigged elections. Yet, for a durable and sustainable transition to flourish and a return to democracy to stand the test of time, to what extent do you think these exiled communities need to return home to vote in elections, hold ground, keep the democratic transition to its promises, keep the regime's forces out of power in future elections, bring back private enterprise, skilled labor, and investment into the country? And so my question is, what incentives can the Trump administration and an incoming transitional government provide for an orderly reverse migration to take place?
It's a good question. It's a big question. So, let's assume a transition, a truly democratic transition, not sort of a cosmetic transition where Maduro leaves and goes to Russia or Turkey. Weather's better in Turkey. I'd recommend that if I were his travel agent. But let's assume there's a transition that takes place that actually brings in a democratic government. The legitimately elected government from last year of Edmundo Gonzalez, the stand-in for Maria Corina Machado. There's a huge set of things that have to be done. It's difficult to exaggerate the level of destruction that the Chavez-Maduro government has created. Sanctions have helped accelerate that, U.S.-based maximum pressure sanctions, but it's largely the corruption and just profligacy of the Chavez and Maduro government. Let me just start with a few. In terms of institutions, this justice system is completely politicized. The armed forces are completely politicized. Many are involved in the sorts of illegal activities that Trump has talked about and accused them. That's well documented. They're also collaborating with, as you mentioned, the illegal non-state actors, the ELN, but there's also the colectivos, which are a paramilitary squad. So you've got to remake an entire security force and make it independent. The opposition says it has the names of about 23 irredeemable members of the military that it would purge, but it would try to work with the others. That's still going to be tough because the problem is the political economy of outsourcing the military to do a lot of corruption or narcotics trafficking or illegal mining means that they have their own resources. You will need to pay them a salary that's livable. You'll never be able to match what they earn by selling cocaine or trafficking in cocaine. So you need to first pay them a livable wage. But meanwhile, the economy has shrunk by about 3/4. It's growing a little bit, but it's really making up what it's lost. It's not really growing from a baseline of zero. It's growing from basically a contraction of more than 75% of GDP. So you have to get the economy going again. But by the same token, infrastructure is collapsed right now in Venezuela. Blackouts are regular. The electrical grid is completely unreliable. A lot of those oil drilling rigs and processing plants were not kept up because of lack of investment, because of lack of both investment by the state-owned oil company PDVSA, but also by lack of investment from outside investors. So those would need to be updated. Hospitals, schools are completely collapsed. And the opposition is saying that it's going to bring in international investment and this can be turned around quickly. And that's difficult to imagine. First of all, as you said earlier, I wouldn't say there's a glut of oil on the market, but Venezuelan oil is heavy. It needs a lot of processing. So it's going to take a lot of time to get those even new ones or existing ones up and running or pumping oil at a significant rate to be able to generate the revenue that's necessary. By the same token, there's been a lot more discoveries of oil that Venezuela will have to compete against in Argentina, in Brazil, in Guyana, for example. It's a different oil market than when Chavez was elected in 1998. The other issue is the distressed debt. Venezuela has $160 billion of distressed debt. A lot of that is owned by hedge funds now. Now, a lot of them they bought very cheaply, but they're obviously going to negotiate as much as they can on the return to be able to make their money. And some of those holders of the debt are Russians and Chinese and Qataris. The debt renegotiation is going to look very different in this case than it did, say, in Argentina or any of the countries in the 1980s during the debt crisis, because you're going to have countries that are deeply opposed to U.S. interests in this. But that's going to be necessary to get Venezuela back onto international capital markets where it can begin to generate loans that it'll need to restore all of the things and build all the things that I mentioned.
And so what about the Venezuelan community? How do you bring them back into the country?
That's a good question. As you mentioned, 8 million people. The truth is many of them, you need their talent. You need their know-how. But I think a lot of them, first of all, left with their families. A lot of them, it's been a long time since they've been leaving. The mass exodus occurred really in 2018, 2019 and beyond. A lot of them have settled. There are 3 million in Colombia, around 1 million in the United States. They've settled. They've integrated their children into schools. Some of them have jobs. They may not be ideal jobs. So I think they're going to be very risk averse. There's not going to be, much as Maria Corina Machado and the opposition loves to say, that people will flood back and rebuild Venezuela. There's going to be a real lag time between there any results in that. And I suspect a number of those Venezuelans that left. Yes, you'll have your energy engineers who've gone to work for Chevron or they're in universities, or a number of financiers who work in the U.S. or Spanish banks who will probably return to help rebuild the country. But a lot of the workforce is going to stay away, at least wait until things seem to start to improve. And it's not going to be an easy snap transition, not only because of the fact that institutions are so crumbled, but also the fact that whatever government comes in, let's assume again it's Edmundo Gonzalez and Maria Corina Machado, it will take they will still have to fight a number of political battles. This won't be a golden path to restore power. Sure. The ELN is going to remain, the Colectivo is going to remain, the possibility of mass insecurity will still be there. I can't see Venezuelans rushing back into Venezuela as much as the country needs them. So,
immigration being such a central issue and policy for the Trump administration with midterms looming, you don't think there's any incentive that the Trump administration, other than canceling TPS, for instance, can provide for those communities to be incentivized to return home?
Yeah, that's a good question. I just don't see the Trump administration investing any money to sort of, because this is sort of, if you will, a corollary to the Biden administration, the roots-based policy towards immigration, which the idea was develop the local economies and people will be less incentivized to leave. I don't see Trump, after dissolving USAID, after ending funding for the National Endowment for Democracy and all of its related institutes, I can't see the Trump administration, basically pumping billions of dollars to rebuild the country, even if it's necessary for the return of many of the immigrants that they love to malign and demonize. It's simply, I just don't think it's in their DNA.
Sure. Let's talk a little bit about Maduro's options and how those play out for Trump in the leading up to the midterms. One is obviously Maduro and the regime entrenches itself, calls Trump's bluff, excuse me, waits out the political resolve and financial cost of this military deployment to get closer to the midterms. Two is Maduro's departure from country to escape U.S. special ops from capturing or killing him without a broad transitional agreement with other regime apparatchiks and military command. And three is a broad transitional agreement with potential immunity and safe passage to regime leadership, which would seek to diffuse any resistance from remaining elements of the regime or the military to avoid a protracted conflict. Question, how do each scenario play out for Trump in the midterms? Is there one specific scenario which can satisfy both the Latino vote and Trump's MAGA base and mobilize both of these electorates to help Trump keep the House in the midterms? Or will he need to sacrifice one to guarantee that the other electorate delivers? And if so, which one do you think Trump is most likely to favor?
Oof, that's a good question. It's a tough one. It forces us to speculate and try to tell the future, but I'm going to give it a shot. You pointed out the fundamental problem, which is Trump is caught between a Marco Rubio-driven policy of regime change and regime change on the cheap. The idea of the massive mobilization of naval assets off the coast of Venezuela, the idea was it would provoke some form of a coup or even maybe just second thoughts by Maduro to leave the country and go somewhere else. That hasn't happened. The opposition's been claiming that was going to happen now for decades. It isn't happening in this case either, and I think he's going to dig in, or at least try to dig in. So since that didn't happen, Trump has doubled down on the military options. And we're already beginning to see some resistance among his MAGA base for the risk of committing U.S. assets to this and the risk of actually putting boots on the ground, which I don't think he would do in an invasion. I'm pretty sure he wouldn't. But it may be necessary at some point for some form of a U.S. force, a stabilizing force in the future. And I think that would be anathema to them. We're already beginning to see signs of that. So now he's suddenly boxed in. And it's funny because at first, when he started this, he defined it only as narco-terrorism. Rubio was talking about regime change, but Trump wasn't. Now he's kind of slipped his own narrative, and he's talking about that Maduro has to go. So now we're facing a standoff. And the truth is that those naval assets cannot remain there forever. The USS Gerald Ford has to probably leave within a month or so, maybe even less. So now Trump is completely in a box. I think, barring some miracle in which there is a massive transition, the military flips, it removes Maduro, and they invite, under international pressure, Edmundo Gonzalez and Maria Corina to the Palacio de Miraflores. It's going to be, someone's going to have to lose. It is, and I don't know how this will play out. So let me give you some of the options, as you were saying. The one is Maduro basically digs in and remains. That will be a disaster for Trump. He'll look weak, especially he staked so much of his bluster. It wasn't even reputation, just his bluster on this and U.S. naval resources, and even, basically committed war crimes in the blowing up of the boats and then the killing of the two survivors from September 2nd. He's put so much on the line. That would be a huge embarrassment. So he's going to have to look for a win some way. And again, he's boxed into the narrative that this is now that Maduro has to go. So I would say that's a possibility. I'd say it was more of a possibility if he hadn't started to talk about Maduro leaving. But there is a chance that he could taco. Trump always chickens out in this. It'd probably be the biggest taco he's ever had, and it would be very public, and it would be condemned by both the MAGA base and the hardliners because he would look weak. It was an own goal in his case because he didn't have to go that far in, that deep in, and so he would lose completely in that. The other option is that Maduro is convinced to leave for some way. And I think if I were a betting man, and I'm not, that's why I'm not an investment banker, is I think what could then happen is that there'd be some form of transitional government that would have some elements of the opposition with a clearly defined time limit and promises to hold free and fair elections, with a completely remade, because right now the Electoral Commission is completely under the thumb of the Chavistas. We saw that when they stole the election last year, but with some credible, maybe even internationally governed body to oversee those elections sometime in the near future. That would not go over well with the opposition. The opposition won the election, and they know that. And every time I mention this to members of the opposition, they always say, well, we had our election. We're the legitimate government. Why would we do that? But Trump, to find some exit, he may need to try to convince the opposition to hold its fire on that. And I don't think that will go over with the Marco Rubios. And Marco Rubio is in regular touch with the opposition. They visited him in his office. He's really committed to them. Now, he's caved on other things seemingly principles that he had before. But this one, I think, he's quite out there publicly. With that would also come a number of other wins, by the way, for Trump. Promises of massive deportation flights to return deportees, and with all of the performance that he's demanded in other countries that have received, which is like taking photos of the undocumented immigrants getting off the planes and leg irons and handcuffs. They do that mostly for Stephen Miller, who's a player in this too. But Stephen Miller doesn't care about democracy in Venezuela. He doesn't care about regime change. He just wants to use this as basically a club to beat up on Democrats for going soft on immigration. Sure. And then the other scenario is, again, that complete regime change. That will require a lot of investment. And the truth is I don't know where that investment will come from in terms of bilateral, multilateral assistance. If you speak to European and Latin American diplomats, this is Trump's baby, and they're just standing by watching it and hoping it doesn't go completely off the rails.
So what is the scenario in which he mobilizes and satisfies both of those electoral bases, the MAGA base and the Latino hawkish base around regime change?
It's the least likely scenario, quite frankly. It is that there's some form of a palace coup that removes Maduro and then invites the opposition in. Trump declares victory. Maria Corina Machado and Edmundo Gonzalez declare victory. They come into the Plaza Miraflores. There's not There's not an ounce of American blood spilled in this. They don't even need to launch missiles. They can sort of declare victory and move on. And the country somehow miraculously manages to stabilize itself overnight. I don't see that as happening, but that would be the best scenario for both sides of these very competing visions that he has to reconcile in his own policy. I think the second best option would be maybe a few military strikes, taking out some of the leaders maybe of the ELN, a few airstrips. He can say, okay, we took out those narco-terrorists, Maduro leaves, and there's some form of coalition government that I mentioned. I think that would be palatable to some of the MAGA folks. I don't think it would be as palatable to the opposition. But, at least if there's a path forward, and we hear this with, Russia's comments about the Ukraine Russia peace deal. He said he was going to have it happen in 24 hours. It hasn't. But yet, even though it continues to stumble along in ways that look like they're very favorable to Russia, he doesn't really get called out on it. So he manages somehow to dodge some of these things. We used to refer to President Ronald Reagan as a Teflon president. There's an element of Teflon in Donald Trump's peace policies.
And assuming that the best case scenario you mentioned is the most unlikely, how does that play out in the midterms, do you think? 10 of the last 12 midterm elections have played unfavorably for the incumbent administration and for the White House. Is there a scenario around Venezuela where the best case, as you mentioned, the least likely case unfolds, and he's able, just with this foreign policy, to retain the House?
I think he'd certainly win Florida with us, Cuban Americans and Venezuelan Americans. But I don't see him retaining the House. I don't think most of your rank and file voters in congressional elections really care much about Venezuela. His base will certainly rally behind him, but his base is around 30%. His popularity is about 40%. But I think there are other things that will play much more strongly into voters' calculations. Affordability. Healthcare. They now have to confront some sort of fix on the healthcare when they tried to kill the Obamacare measures in the budget that was passed. I think the issues of immigration will play. So maybe, if he can declare a victory on this in terms of we've removed the Tren de Aragua, which is a Venezuelan gang group, which he accused during the campaign of overtaking Aurora, Colorado, a city in Colorado, he could score some points in that level. But I think voters are mostly going to be making their calculations on bread and butter local issues.
It's the economy, stupid.
Exactly.
All right. Let's talk about outside forces.
Which, by the way, I want to say,
sure.
Which is one of the reasons why Kamala Harris didn't win the election. Donald Trump intuited that it was the economy stupid, and she sort of, that explains why he won by not a large margin, but he won both the popular vote and the electoral vote because he hammered away basically on the cost of eggs. It worked.
We talked about outside forces, whether state or non-state actors, that could be the biggest impediment to a peaceful transition of power. We hear about Russia and China having major influence on the ground by giving financial, military, political support to Maduro, including weapon systems. We hear, but to a lesser extent, about Cuba. Yet Cuba's main export these past decades, aside from doctors, have been military advisors and intelligence support to this regime, but also other leftist governments. and, more troubling, to Farc dissidents and ELN guerrilla. They were instrumental, Cuba was, in keeping Chavez in power during the 2002 attempted coup, when Fidel Castro reached out directly to some of the Venezuelan generals as the crisis was unfolding. Can you speak to the actual level of influence each of these countries has over Maduro and other regime apparatchiks like Minister of Interior Cabello or the Vice President Delcy Rodriguez or the Defense Minister Vladimir Padrino?
I think most of that support is symbolic, but they're the only friends Maduro has. After his stolen election, they were the only governments that recognized his election. North Korea, Iran, Russia, China, Cuba, Nicaragua. Not quite a rogues gallery, quite frankly. And most of them are not even powerful enough to help support him. Look, I suspect what Russia would like is to see the U.S. tied down in a conflict in Venezuela. And this idea of a potential military invasion, which I think is unlikely, not just because it's dangerous, but also because Trump really doesn't like these wars. He really doesn't, and he's pledged to not commit the U.S. to the so-called forever wars of Iraq and Afghanistan. But I fully suspect that they would love to see the U.S. somehow tied down in Venezuela, and that they would be willing to continue to supply arms, again, on the cheap. It wouldn't take much for basically to support the ELN and breakaway factions of the Venezuelan government. Venezuela is a country that's twice the size of California. It's huge, mountainous, jungle. The opportunities for some form of irregular conflict of ELN or guerrillas or decommissioned military officers to continue to stoke both illegality but as well as conflict to weaken the government and a potential U.S. ally, I think would completely be within their remit, if you will. They would love to do that. And that includes China. It includes Iran. It includes Russia. Right now, they are tied to a very corrupt, mismanaged government. And again, if you talk to some people in those regimes or from those regimes and countries, they recognize this is kind of clownish government, quite frankly. But it's like Franklin Delano Roosevelt once said about Anastasio Somoza. Yes, he's a SOB, but he's our SOB. This is sort of like, yeah, he's a clown, but he's our clown. If they could get a way in which the U.S. gets tied down in some way and could continue to sow division within U.S. domestic politics over Venezuela, they'd love that.
Now, you talked about ELN and Farc and other non-state actors. So I'm going to stay on the topic of Cuba, which seemed to be kind of central to the Florida base and linked to regime change in Venezuela. You and I know that Raul Castro was instrumental in brokering the peace accord between Colombia's government and the Farc's back in 2016, thus ending the longest conflict in the hemisphere at Obama's request and in exchange for U.S. normalization with the regime in Havana. We hear a lot about Qatar's mediation role between Maduro and the U.S. government, and you were just in Qatar 3 days ago, so perhaps you can speak to their role in resolving this crisis. But is there also a deal to be made with Castro and the Cuban regime to guarantee that should a transition actually unfold, Cuba would not activate their ELN and Farc guerrilla networks against the transitional government with protracted hybrid operations, sabotage, and the likes across the 8 of the 24 provinces that these guerrillas currently hold? We hear the Cuban regime has reached out to the U.S. government in recent days about the crisis. So what instruments or levers might the U.S. government have to diffuse Cuban interference to this transition, in your opinion?
It's a good question. You going back and talking about the Obama years and this Juan Manuel Santos, the president of Colombia, who negotiated the peace with the Farc, doing it in Cuba, in Cuba, sort of demonstrates also how much things have changed. That would never happen now. This administration would never accept peace negotiations that occurred in Cuba, brokered by the Castro government. They would also not do what Obama did when he spoke to Juan Manuel Santos and said, quote, "There are no red lines." In other words, the people we have on our extradition lists, if you want to negotiate away those extradition lists, you can. The most important thing is peace, not us enforcing on you our own justice. That, as we see, it never happens. Of course, we're blowing up people with less evidence than those extradition treaties, so it's difficult to imagine. I quite frankly don't see it happening. The Marco Rubio and many of the people in the government so deeply distrust the Castro government, they simply don't believe anything the Castros would. Well, it's only one Castro. He's not officially in government, although his son is. Raul Castro's son is kind of the power behind the throne. I just don't think they trust them enough to do that. And I'll be honest, I think Obama, and in particular Ben Rhodes, who was his national security advisor, sort of missed a chance there. They should have used the opening in Cuba to quickly try to pressure Cuba to engage in some sort of brokered change. And I think in part the Democrats were so sure they were going to win in 2016 that they sort of just postponed that. In the end, they never leveraged what was, I think, one of the most strategically important moments in recent history in U.S.-Latin American relations. They never leveraged it for the larger problem, which is Venezuela. Cuba is not a security threat to the United States. In fact, I was briefing, I won't say who, a senior military officer after the Obama changes, and he pointed to a map of Cuba. And he says, see, and he pointed to the north. He says, those are all bays and keys, which would be prime real estate for narcotics traffickers to bring in drugs to the United States. Right now, the Castro government doesn't let that happen. That's what we're most worried about. So, quite frankly, U.S. interest, as cruel as this may sound, is sort of served by a government that has not become a narco state, unlike Venezuela. So Venezuela is the real issue. They, as I like to say, the Obama administration became a little much too in love with its policy towards Cuba and didn't try to leverage it effectively enough. Right now, yes, there are negotiations going on in Qatar. I met with one of the negotiators while I was there. They have a few things they want to put on the table. One of them was one of the options I mentioned. I just don't think that will necessarily fly. But they are indeed in the process of negotiation. This is not simply the Maduro government hiding out in a bunker trying to avoid missiles. There is a process of negotiation going on. Where that will lead and how much that will be acceptable to the U.S., to the opposition, but then to the U.S. is unclear. But things are, it's like a duck. The feet are moving underneath the water, even though the duck seems to be completely still.
It's very impressive what Qatar's foreign policy has been on the mediation front, whether it's in Haiti or Venezuela or in the Gaza settlement. Do you see them playing an increasingly important role in the Western Hemisphere alongside the United States to resolve tensions?
Yes, absolutely. And I was at the Doha Forum last week, or this weekend, and several things struck me. First of all, there are a number of panels on Gulf Coast countries and Latin America. Not just in terms of relations and mediation, though that was one of the panels, but another one was on investment. And the truth is, the Qataris, they have a lot of money. If you go to Doha, it's a city that's been, just a magnificent city that's grown up in just two decades. And, amazing architecture. They have an incredible education village city, which is out just a little bit outside the center. You have Cornell University there, Northwestern University, American University, the Qatari University, Texas A&M, and half the students are international. They're clearly trying to project themselves internationally. But the other thing that came up in two panels I was on, one I was at, was the opportunity that Qataris and other Gulf Coast countries could actually seek to replace or displace Chinese investment in infrastructure in key areas, that they could be a specific broker. And in fact, in a conversation that I was not on, but in with the U.S. ambassador to NATO, he said precisely that. We see Qatar as an ally. And while he didn't say it precisely, it clearly has enough cash and enough interest in projecting its national interests and its sort of profile as a broker to try to displace Chinese investment, or at least offer an alternative that the U.S. simply doesn't have the cash to do or even the interest to do. And the Qataris love infrastructure. They're very good at it. Up until now, most of their investment has been in debt. But I think we're going to see. In fact, we even talked about with the former foreign minister of Panama, as also the foreign minister of Panama, the current one, talked about the idea of creating investment packages to sell to the Qataris. So I think there'll be a lot of interest, and I think the U.S. would look very favorably on that. We're far from where Qatar was isolated by its neighbors 10 years ago, and clearly they've managed to turn this around and build really a very powerful sort of soft power and international diplomacy.
I want to go back to your comment on Marco Rubio being so involved with the Western Hemisphere as a senator and now as National Security Advisor and Secretary of State. Traditionally, the vice president was the one to have kind of oversight over the Western Hemisphere in previous administrations. With Secretary Rubio's dual role and his intimate understanding of the hemisphere's key challenges, does that mean J.D. Vance has been eclipsed in that regional oversight function by Marco Rubio? Or does it mean that the new foreign policy pivot to the Western Hemisphere, which was elaborated in the national security strategy, will simply just bring back firmly the region under the Oval Office oversight?
So, first of all, more than anything, Marco Rubio's interest and knowledge of the region has overshadowed the apparatus, the Western Hemisphere apparatus in the State Department. I don't even know who the assistant secretary. I think he's an acting assistant secretary of state for the Western Hemisphere. This is all
Kojak.
Is it okay? Yeah. Okay, Michael Kozak. But he's not a very public figure. He's former.
He's career technocrat.
Career technocrat. Yeah. But Marco Rubio is the one who's leading this. I think there are two things going on. I do think the national security strategy did have J.D. Vance's fingerprints on it. I think that it does reflect, especially on the European side, it does reflect a lot of his previously known views. And I think, again, this idea of looking at the hemisphere as a projection of U.S., as an area that needs projection of U.S. power, not even influence, also reflects J.D. Vance's own views. I think the policy is also being driven in part by Stephen Miller, the deputy chief of staff, who's the immigration hardliner. For him, he sees this entirely as a domestic issue, stopping the border, stopping drugs. For him, if you will, he's a person who's tending to the domestic, as you implied, the domestic implications of Trump's Western Hemisphere policies, and that's driving it. But yes, Marco Rubio, he occupies both the Secretary of State position and the National Security Advisor position, is clearly driving this policy. We'll see, again, if there's some forced compromise on Venezuela that isn't absolute and complete regime change, how he manages to deal with that and address that and tries to sell it. And that, I think, will, if in fact he is forced to backtrack a bit, I think it may signal a little weakening of his position within the team that's handling the Western Hemisphere. And I suspect at a certain point, and I've heard some of these discussions are beginning to take place, that Trump may blame him for putting him in a position where he's going to have to look weak. And at that point, while I don't think he'll be forced to resign, I think his stock within the Trump administration may decline.
Very well. To close our conversation, let's assume for a second you were invited to Mar-a-Lago tomorrow and advise the president on what his next move should be on Venezuela. What would be your 3 main bullet points to him?
The first is start to look for an exit. You're not going to get that transition, that magic, cheap transition that you're hoping for. The second is begin to talk to moderate elements of the opposition, not necessarily the government in waiting, the legitimate government in waiting. And the third is begin to imagine a negotiated path out of this, given the fact that I don't think the military will flip, that will give some breathing space for an interim government. And I don't think you'll get the top line Chavistas should not be sitting around the table in the interim government. And that includes Los Hermanos Rodriguez, Delcy, and Jorge Rodriguez. It includes Padrino Lopez, it includes Diosdado Cabello, who are all in cahoots. You need to find other officials that may be a little more amenable to negotiation and compromise, because that interim process will give you a chance not just to begin to stage elections, credible, internationally overseen, objectively monitored elections and organized elections, but it can also allow for some compromise to begin to lay the groundwork for a much more successful and peaceful transition where, in fact, you can begin to purge elements of the armed forces, professionalize other elements of the armed forces, tamp down the non-state actors like ELN and like the colectivos, and begin to negotiate with the bondholders over Venezuelan debt so it can return to international capital markets and begin to lighten the sanctions so that international investors can begin to come in to invest in oil. those funds can be held in reserve. It isn't a perfect example, but the oil for food program under Saddam Hussein was deeply corrupt. But I think some independently managed budgetary process that can begin to provide assistance does not allow the Chavistas in whatever form to be able to control and distribute patronage to only allies can help ensure that what the opposition inherits when they win the election, and they will, would be a softer landing and not a complete state collapse.
Thank you very much, Chris.
Thanks, Stan. It's a pleasure.
For your expertise and helping us better understand this watershed moment for Venezuela and our region. I hope you'll agree to come back on the show, and we can do that more often so that we can follow what is a rapidly evolving situation and the consequences for the Western Hemisphere and U.S. national security concerns.
You're welcome anytime if we want to do it here again.
Sure. Thank you again.
Thanks.
Great. Thanks, Phil.